Okay, next up is Glen Hook, talking about septic contamination of groundwater in subdivisions built on fractured bedrock.
Hello, my name is Glen Hook, and my research focuses on connecting the subsurface geology of a subdivision with its potential for groundwater contamination from septic systems. Recently, a restaurant was built in Green Bay, and it had its own septic system and its own private drinking well. E. coli was found within the well of 7 weeks after opening, resulting in 236 and 6 deaths. It was then determined that the restaurant was built on fractured bedrock, which allowed the septic derived waste to reach the groundwater supply within hours. The scariest part of this story is that the septic system was built entirely to code and had no real lawful violations. In Eau Claire, there are both established and developing subdivisions with a lot of homes in a small area, where each house has their own septic system and private drinking well. Similarly to the restaurant in Green Bay, these subdivisions are built directly on top of fractured bedrock. Although septic systems don't treat wastewater, it was historically assumed that the rock can filter the water as it travels through it. Since the early 2000s, though, it has been found that this is untrue. Instead, water travels preferentially along vertical and horizontal fractures in the rock very quickly, making septic contamination in groundwater much more likely than previously thought due to the lack of filtration. Ultimately, the biggest fear is that the subdivisions could be contaminating their neighbor's water or their own, just like the restaurant in Green Bay. You can now understand why the geology and groundwater flow of well septic properties is imperative. We have found that a cheap, easy, and fairly reliant way to characterize subdivision subsurface geology is to utilize domestic well logs and rock exposed at the surface. After proper characterization, water samples from each house in the subdivision can be collected. These samples come directly from the house owner's private wells. Lab analysis of the water samples is then done to determine whether septic contamination is occurring or not. Among other generic tests, we are using septic indicators such as pharmaceuticals and artificial sweeteners to determine whether contamination is occurring. Artificial sweeteners in pharmaceuticals, such as acetaminophen and sucralose, are great indicators of human waste since they are common in human everyday consumption. Therefore, these compounds will be able to tell us for sure whether these subdivisions are contaminating their groundwater or not. The ultimate achievement of this research would be to contribute to updating building codes and subdivision policies of cities like Eau Claire to account for their bedrock geology. Possible updates could include changes to subdivision spacing or extending public utilities to meet these communities. Hopefully, with these proper regulations, cases such as that of the Green Bay restaurant will never occur in Wisconsin again.
Question from the judges?
Where did your idea come from?
Actually, so my research mentor kind of took action against a subdivision they were planning here in Eau Claire because it was gonna be directly in this bedrock, and gradient was they were just gonna stack these houses right in the gradient direction, and they actually didn't build this subdivision because there was such a fuss over it. And so we kind of thought we'd look at existing subdivisions and see if we can find a safe housing density for these septic and private well subdivisions.
How long ago was the Green Bay situation?
I think it was in 2012.